to establish this corporate style board for Donald Trump personally to have full legislative, executive, military, and economic control over the future of the Palestinian Gaza Strip. Let's be clear. This is a corporate board takeover so that Trump can engage in economic self-dealing for his own benefit. We're now seeing how he wants to introduce cryptocurrency to Gaza, undoubtedly his own cryptocurrency, to personally profit off of the misery of Palestinian survivors of Israel's genocide.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're a voice of conscience for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. This interview is the third of a three-part series, Militarism at Home and Abroad, U.S. Domestic and Foreign Policy and its Implications in the Middle East. I've interviewed former Bernie Sanders foreign policy advisor, Center for International Policy's Matt Duss, and former Biden State Department official who resigned because of their rush to supply arms to Israel during the genocide in Gaza, Josh Paul, from A New Policy. Josh Ruebner is the policy director for the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project. He previously worked for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Josh is also a lecturer in Georgetown University's program on justice and peace and a faculty fellow in their Center for Social Justice Research. Josh, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Josh, we'll get granular about some of the following in just a few minutes, but I want you to take a few minutes to give us a 5,000-foot analysis. Iran, Gaza, Venezuela, Mexico, Minneapolis, Portland, Greenland, even Greenland, and more. We're overwhelmed. I've been calling it the politics of intentional chaos. What are your thoughts about a thread? Can you give us a thread that runs through these disparate offenses from the U.S. administration?
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael, for having me on this call. And thanks to the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace for hosting this series. You're right. I mean, we have been drinking from the fire hose of a torrent of Trump administration policies, both domestically and internationally, that are both meant to subvert the entire international human rights order constructed after World War II, and also to obliterate democratic rights that we have here at home. So they're definitely connected in a worldview that the Trump administration is pushing. I wrote earlier this year in an article in Zateo about the so-called Don Roe Doctrine, which is what Trump christened his hostile takeover of Venezuela, where we went in with unauthorized and illegal military force to remove a sitting president from office and abduct him to the United States to face trial. This Don Roe Doctrine, I wrote in Zateo, is this really naked form of 19th century just brutal colonialism. And to really understand the genesis of Trump's Don Roe Doctrine toward Latin America, we really need look no further than Gaza to understand where this policy came from. So what the Trump administration has done with this 20-point plan for Gaza, which was inaugurated last October, is to establish this corporate style board for Donald Trump personally to have full legislative, executive, military, and economic control over the future of the Palestinian Gaza Strip. Let's be clear. This is a corporate board takeover so that Trump can engage in economic self-dealing for his own benefit. We're now seeing how he wants to introduce cryptocurrency to Gaza, undoubtedly his own cryptocurrency, to personally profit off of the misery of Palestinian survivors of Israel's genocide, but also to enrich his friends and his family and his political donors to reconstruct Gaza not in the interests and for the benefit of Palestinian survivors of Israel's genocide, but for their own vested personal economic gain. And what is most grotesque, I think, about this plan is that the United Nations actually gave its sanction and its
Yeah.
approval for Trump's corporate personal takeover of Gaza. And we've seen subsequently how Trump has said that his board is going to take over the functions of the United Nations and that he's trying to insert this board into other international conflict areas as well, such as Sudan, for example. So we've really seen the privatization of foreign policy in Trump's unilateralist colonialist foreign policies abroad, not just in Venezuela, not just in Gaza, but we see this in the threats to take over Greenland as well. So what connects this cowboy imperialist takeover foreign policy mentality to the domestic policies of the Trump administration? I think there's a very clear strand. It's this strand of authoritarianism. Trump is trying to be a personal dictator over affairs of Venezuela, of Gaza, of Greenland, but he's also enacting authoritarian policies here at home. And to be quite honest, these authoritarian policies are being pursued in order to advance a white supremacist political agenda. That's what we're seeing with the mass deportation programs. That's what we're seeing with ICE imprisoning and abducting not only families, but also students who have spoken out for Palestinian rights. And of course, how we're seeing ICE execute Americans on the streets who are protesting their policies. So it is, of course, an incredibly dangerous time. The precarity of American democracy, I don't think has ever been greater. I don't think it's at all an exaggeration to state that we are on the verge of a potential authoritarian takeover if Trump gets his way. So the policies that he's pursuing to tie these together, the foreign policies, the domestic policies, they all need to be confronted and challenged by Americans and by anyone who's concerned with human rights.
Let's follow up on that, Josh. You'll be teaching a course, or maybe you've already taught. I think you're going to be teaching it in the fall. U.S. Foreign Policy and the International Order, which you say will examine the international order established largely through U.S. leadership in the post-World War II era, including many of the important institutions and conventions like the UN, the International Court of Justice, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and others. As you just pointed out, the president and his supporters seem hell-bent on subverting, undermining, or even replacing those institutions in an international rule-based order. So you want to say more about that and tell us about your course?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I did my dissertation work in the Truman administration era, and it wasn't apparent to me before I did this research just what an integral role the United States played in helping to establish all of the international institutions and covenants and conventions that really form the bulwark of the post-World War II international order. So we're talking not only about the United Nations and its charter calling for self-determination, but we're also talking about things like the Fourth Geneva Convention to protect civilians in time of war. We're talking about the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. all of these were institutions and conventions that the United States avidly and actively supported during their creation. The idea being that we would not see a repetition of all the horrors and the atrocities of World War II committed again. And that's what makes me so angry when I hear Senator Lindsey Graham saying, because we bombed Dresden, because we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons in World War II, that Israel is entitled to do the same thing against Palestinians. What Lindsey Graham doesn't understand is that the United States helped put in place conventions that would make sure that not only the United States, but all other countries could never do something like that again in terms of deliberately targeting and impacting civilians during the time of war. So it's not only the Trump administration that is fundamentally undermining the post-World War II international order that was largely established by the United States. This is something that goes back decades, right? So we can point to the Eisenhower administration in terms of the coups that it undertook in Iran, in Guatemala, the CIA role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. All of these things occurred during the Eisenhower administration and undermine the fundamental tenets of self-determination that are supposed to be at the heart of the post-World War II international order. And we could talk about lots of other administrations as well. I mean, look, the International Court of Justice was another institution that the United States helped stand up in the aftermath of World War II. There was an advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice back in the 1980s that said that the United States was committing terrorism against Nicaragua by mining its harbors, and that the United States was obligated to pay reparations to the country of Nicaragua for those acts of terrorism. We still haven't paid those reparations, right? So we've been undermining this World War II international order for a long, long time. And I'll also say that all of the support, the lockstep support that the Biden administration provided for Israel to commit genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, the first live streamed genocide, fundamentally undermined the entirety of the international legal order. Because how can you criticize Russia for invading Ukraine and criticize Russia for deliberately targeting civilian homes, deliberately targeting hospitals, engaging in massacres of civilians, all these things which are true and which absolutely should be condemned, don't get me wrong. But how can you do that and not turn around and say that this also applies to Israel? Either these systems apply to everyone equally and are valid internationally, or they're not valid whatsoever. So, the Trump administration, I think, is an exacerbation of the undermining of the World War II order. And it's definitely a difference in quality and a difference in kind, but it is on a fundamental trajectory that we've seen since the 1950s of the United States undermining the values that we supposedly supported in the aftermath of World War II.
Let's talk about today. The president, as you know, has ordered U.S. military buildup for military action in Iran. I mean, I could go into all the details, but they've been caught. The dollar has been given short change within the country. Israel sharing intelligence goading the U.S. into war. The Arab world's nervously preparing for a U.S. military strike. So, Josh, unravel for us this U.S., Israel, Saudi connection vis-a-vis Iran and its implications for us.
Unfortunately, it does seem that U.S. active aggression against Iran is becoming more and more of a likelihood, if not a certainty at this point, given all of the military assets that the Trump administration has moved into the Middle East in order to attack Iran. Look, this would be the second time that Trump has engaged in unauthorized and illegal use of US force to attack Iran. We did it at Israel's behest in June of last year. The Trump administration, lest it be forgotten, said that as a result of the US attack on Iran, that Iran's nuclear facilities were completely decimated. And Trump even put out a statement on White House stationery saying that any news to the contrary is quote unquote fake news, right? So if the United States has really decimated Iran's capabilities in the nuclear arena, what's the justification for another unauthorized and illegal attack? Let's be very clear. Congress has not provided the president with the authorization for the use of military force against Iran. This is a congressional prerequisite to engage US military forces abroad. That's why an attack by Trump against Iran would not only violate US law, but it would also violate international law because Iran has not engaged in any act of aggression against the United States that would justify a military response. And there is no UN resolution passed by the Security Council authorizing some form of collective defense against Iran. So it would be patently illegal, both on the domestic and the international fronts. It will also be extremely devastating for the Iranian people who have suffered enough, both under a draconian system of US sanctions and also repression at the hands of their own regime. This US attack is not going to liberate Iranians from the undemocratic regime under which they live. Let's be very clear. Haven't we learned the lesson of Iraq? Haven't we learned the lesson of Afghanistan that it's not our military force that is capable of producing democratic regime change? Let's be real. Donald Trump ran on a platform of opposing and objecting to these forever wars. And now he wants to launch a new one with perhaps much even greater ramifications for us as a country than the disastrous war on Iraq. Let's not forget that Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. And we all remember how difficult it was to engage in a military occupation of Iraq after we overthrew Saddam's regime. Let's not kid ourselves into thinking that this type of illegal war against Iran would be anything but something much, much more difficult. So it's an incredibly dangerous time. I think Iran does have capabilities to strike against US interests in the region, potentially even here domestically. So the vast majority of Americans do not want to see an attack on Iran. There is an effort in Congress to invoke the War Powers Resolution to try to prevent the Trump administration from engaging militarily against Iran. And hopefully that bill passes when it comes up for a vote, I think next week.
Let's talk about Palestine and Israel, Josh. 872 days of genocide since October the 7th, 2023. And that's not even to say anything about the decades and decades of ethnic cleansing before then. U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, made the news in the last week or so. Maybe we ought to be grateful for him for at least telling the truth out loud, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, where he said that the Bible gave Israel the right to the land between the Nile to the Euphrates, not only the West Bank, but Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, parts of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. And on Monday, and then of course there was a great hue and cry saying, well, this isn't really Israel's policy. But then on Monday, liberal Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid agreed with Mike Huckabee. What's your take?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Mike Huckabee said the quiet part out loud because this is something that Mike Huckabee has always said.
That's right. That's right.
Mike Huckabee is a Christian Zionist as he defines himself. who believes that Israel's expansion and conquest of additional land will lead to the end of times. And this is very much a theologically driven foreign policy that he is trying to impose on the Trump administration and on our country in general, acting in this very important position as U.S. ambassador to Israel. It even goes well beyond the extremism of David Friedman, who was Trump's ambassador to Israel during his first term. This was someone who raised millions and millions of dollars to support Israel's illegal colonization of Palestinian land. Even David Friedman stopped at the idea of Israel annexing the West Bank. For him, it was never a question of going beyond that. For now, for Huckabee to be talking about Israel having the right to take over and annex Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, is just really part of this. I don't know what other word to use, but batty eschatological foreign policy that Huckabee is trying to impose on this country. I mean, look, the Trump administration says that it doesn't support Israel's annexation of the West Bank, but reality says otherwise. Israel has taken a number of very clear steps to de facto annex the Palestinian West Bank. Israeli politicians have made clear that these steps are meant to impose Israel's jurisdiction over the West Bank, and thus its annexation over the West Bank. And just today, we read in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, that the U.S. embassy to Israel is now offering consular services. In other words, get your visa, get your passport stamped in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. This is a clear diplomatic recognition by the Trump administration of not only the legitimacy in their eyes of Israel's settlements in the West Bank, but also Israel's jurisdiction over the West Bank. Let's be very clear that this is what this means. And let's go back to some of the drastic changes in US policy that were made under the first Trump administration, none of which, by the way, were reversed by Biden afterward. So remember the Pompeo Doctrine? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that settlements were not illegal under international law. The United States amended its bilateral agreements with Israel for scientific research, for educational cooperation, for energy development, et cetera, to enable U.S.-Israeli cooperation with illegal Israeli settlements. They were previously excluded from the scope of these agreements. And lastly, the Trump administration, in its first term, actually made it permissible for products from illegal Israeli settlements to be imported to the United States with a Made in Israel label on them. So let's be very clear. Well before Mike Huckabee's interview with Tucker Carlson, the Trump administration took incredibly active steps, not only to legitimize illegal Israeli settlements, but also to pave the way for Israel's annexation of the West Bank.
I want you to talk about, well, thanks for that answer. The clarity there is really important that this precedes Huckabee and also precedes Trump, right? And precedes even like it's bipartisan in so many different ways. I want you to talk about normalization. Um, I work closely with Jeff Halper at ICAD, and Jeff's been talking from even before October 7th about Israel's and the U.S.'s agenda of normalization, that is, normalizing peace. So Trump declares peace, the Gaza war is over, he's got a border peace. Uh, and Jeff says that normalization signals the end for Palestinians because the world then just moves on. You just move on to some other issue, and we have short attention spans. Uh, so he says we need to keep naming it and fighting it in whatever way we can. I want you to talk, unravel the layers to this normalization process. There's propaganda machines in Israel and the U.S. We're buying off Arab countries in the Abraham Accords, especially the role, and then also the role of the corporate mainstream media and others. So I know there's a lot there, but your thoughts about normalization?
Yeah, this was really the cornerstone of the Trump administration's Middle East policy during its first term, the so called Abraham Accords, which opened up a degree of diplomatic relationships between Israel on the one hand and going from west to east, Morocco, Sudan, the UAE, and Bahrain. Okay. What this did was it undermined the basic premise of UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was passed in the aftermath of the 1967 war, which set about the land for peace framework for resolving Israeli Palestinian and Israeli Arab issues in general. The idea being that Israel would get guarantees of peace and security when it withdrew from Arab territories that it had conquered in this war. So, what the Abraham Accords attempted to do was to pull the rug out of 242 and to say that Israel could have its cake and eat it too. In other words, establish normal diplomatic relations with additional Arab countries without having to withdraw from additional Arab lands. Most importantly, the occupied Palestinian territories. But let's not forget the Syrian Golan Heights, which Israel not only is still occupying, but which the Trump administration recognized Israel's illegal annexation of during its first term. Okay. So, what did these four Arab countries get in return for signing on to the Abraham Accords? Morocco got advanced weaponry from the United States, and it also got US diplomatic recognition for its illegal annexation of the Western Sahara. Sudan, for its efforts, got delisted from the US list of countries supporting terrorism, which took away a lot of sanctions against Sudan, which opened up a lot of trade and investment possibilities for Sudan. And the UAE and Bahrain got advanced weaponry as well. So these were bribes. Let's be clear, these were bribes that were given to these countries to open up diplomatic relations with Israel. And General Miguel Correa, who was the prime negotiator of these agreements on the tactical level, obviously it was Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who inspired and kind of led the meta effort. But it was General Correa who led the day-to-day efforts. And he gave a very, very revealing interview to the newspaper Jewish Insider. And he said that the purpose of the Abraham Accords was to, quote, put Palestinians on an island.
Hmm.
He admitted that this was the rationale for the Abraham Accords. It was to diplomatically and politically isolate Palestinians so that they would be in an even weaker position to confront Israel. So the idea being that with Palestinians weakened diplomatically, with their Arab brothers and sisters turning their backs on them, they would be more susceptible to have to submit to Israel's diktats. And let's remember what Trump's so-called peace to prosperity plan was when he rolled that out towards the end of his first administration. This was to enable Israel to annex whatever lands it wanted to in the West Bank in advance of any negotiations with the Palestinians, right? So you have to understand that Abraham Accords is being intricately involved in this Trump administration attempt to diplomatically weaken the Palestinians so that Israel can impose perpetual apartheid-like conditions over them.
I When I lived in St. Louis, I worked with a group called Friends of Tibet. We also know the example of the indigenous peoples in our country. Um, Genocide, that word itself has almost become normalized. I mean, it's like muzak in an elevator. It's like elevator music, you know? I mean, but it's a powerful word because we're talking about the extermination, not only of individuals in murdering individuals, we're talking about the extermination of a culture, of a history, of a people, in human memory. Are we are we there with our friends in Palestine? I know that there's lots of resistance, but I'm thinking about just the bipartisan efforts at genocide in our country. I'm thinking of nuclear armed Israel, and I'm thinking of a feckless EU and the United Nations. Respond.
I think it's important that we understand Zionism and the actions of the state of Israel through the lens of settler colonialism. And I think it's important to do that for a number of reasons. Number one, it helps to demystify the issue, it helps to de exceptionalize the issue. It helps us to understand how what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people is part of a broader global dynamic of settler colonialism, and a system that's been inflicted on indigenous people in other countries and other continents. You mentioned the United States. And we can look at how this pattern of settler colonialism was also imposed on the indigenous people of Algeria, South Africa, Australia, on and on, as we all know. The late great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, talked about genocide being a potential but not inevitable conclusion of a settler colonial process. But he talked about how all settler colonialisms have a common denominator to them, and that is to eliminate the native, to eliminate the presence of the indigenous population. And how a settler colonial society attempts to eliminate the indigenous population can vary from generation to generation, and the settler colonial society can engage in different forms, different tactics, different strategies of elimination. So sometimes the elimination looks like forced assimilation, right? So we could look into our own history as a settler colonial society and talk about how we ripped indigenous children away from their parents and forced them into these white boarding schools where they were whipped and beaten if they dared to speak their own indigenous tongue, right? That's a form of settler colonial elimination. It's a cultural genocide of the indigenous people by trying to forcibly get them to shed their indigenous identity. So that's one form of eliminating, but obviously the elimination can be done through violence as well, up to and including acts of genocide. So I think that what we're seeing right now in 2026 with the genocidal levels of violence that Israel is inflicting on the Palestinian people is, in many respects, the logical and perhaps even inevitable consequence of a settler colonial movement and identity. And it's extremely scary because I think in many respects, we are moving toward some kind of end game. And I am very concerned that we have not yet seen the worst of what Israel intends to do to the Palestinian people.
That's a sobering assessment, especially coming from you, Joshua. I respect your analysis so much. It's a sobering assessment. Um, as soon as we're done here, I'm driving to pick up Israeli peace activist and conscientious objector Sahar Vardi, who we're hosting here tonight and tomorrow in Fort Wayne. Her expertise is in Israel's exportation of military weaponry and its impact on the environment. You want to say a word about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trump administration right now is negotiating with Israel to conclude a new memorandum of understanding. So let me back up a moment. These memoranda of understanding, or MOUs for short, have been signed between the United States and Israel ever since the Clinton administration to kind of spell out a decade long agreement for the type of assistance that the United States will give to Israel. So, in the beginning, it was both economic assistance and weapons. It's since moved to being 100% weapons in nature. So, the Trump administration and Israel are right now negotiating on the contours for the next MOU. And what Israel wants to do is that instead of getting what's called foreign military financing. That's when Congress passes appropriation for us to give things like tanks and helicopters and planes and bombs and all of the type of weapons that we traditionally give to Israel at taxpayer expense. What Israel wants to do is transform this model right now. And instead of getting those weapons at taxpayer expense, instead, what they want is for the Pentagon to finance what's called the co-production of weapons, meaning that the United States and Israel work together on the production of different weapon systems. This is something that's already in place. The United States already spends more than $500 million every year to co-produce anti-missile weapons with Israel. Okay, so what this means in practice is that there are more than 100 US companies that are working with Israeli weapons manufacturers to produce these weapons here in the United States. What Israel wants to do now is greatly expand this co-production of weapons with the United States. And what that means is that we will even be further enmeshed and further implicated in Israel's development of weapons. Now, we've heard for years from Israeli weapons manufacturers and Israeli military officials that Gaza is the testing ground for weapons that Israeli weapons manufacturers field test on Palestinians before they export them to other countries around the world. So we're seeing incredibly worrisome AI surveillance of Palestinians, AI directed warfare against Palestinians. There's been all these exposés that have come out in the last 2.5 years of genocide, primarily by the Israeli investigative journal 972, which has done some amazing reporting on how Israel is generating AI lists of targets of individuals who are being killed by remote control drones in Gaza. This is the level of automation of Israeli fighting in Gaza. And this is the model that Israel wants to export to the United States. So if you read, as I did, some of the policy papers from groups like the Heritage Foundation and Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which are calling for more of these co-produced weapons between the United States and Israel, they're talking about how they want to benefit from Israel's testing of these weapons, especially when it comes to AI, especially when it comes to border patrol, to export these models here to the United States. So imagine, and here again, we go back to what you mentioned at the outset, Michael, the connections between the foreign policy and the domestic policies. Imagine an ICE even more emboldened and unaccountable with these AI-driven weapons of surveillance and biometric control over the population. We already know that ICE is using some of these features in terms of Microsoft AI to generate targets for arrest. So when we talk about co-producing these weapons with Israel and exporting them more and more to the domestic context, we have to understand Gaza is the test case scenario for this,
Yeah.
right? Gaza is the test case scenario for the type of control that Israel has over that population. And this is what they want to sell to the United States in terms of domestic control here. So the dangers with the creeping authoritarianism of the Trump administration with these kind of weapons at its disposal is truly dystopian, is truly frightening.
I read recently that I want to move now toward what we can do and our response. Um, I read recently that the Institute for Middle East Understanding and the Justice Democrats are investing $100,000 in a candidate in Texas. I used to just write off Congress, but there's a growing sense, I think, especially since October 7th, 2023, in Congress that there are openings at least. Let's say it that way. You want to say a little bit about the Institute and why you decided to move in this direction?
Sure, absolutely. And just to clarify, this was the IMEU policy project, which is the 501c4 electoral arm that does allow
Important to make that distinction between 501c3 and 501c4. Thank
yeah,
you. Thank you, Josh.
absolutely. But no, look, we've seen some really dramatic developments in Congress, especially over the last couple of years of Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. It was once considered the third rail of US domestic politics to question whether we should be giving Israel weapons or not. But we are now to the point where when Senator Bernie Sanders has called for votes on what are called joint resolutions of disapproval to block specific weapons deliveries to Israel, we now have more than half of all Senate Democrats voting to block these weapons to Israel. We have a bill in Congress right now, the Block the Bombs Act, which was introduced by Congresswoman Delia Ramirez of Illinois, that would proactively prevent the Trump administration from delivering to Israel all of the types of bombs that it has used to inflict genocide on Palestinians in Gaza, as well as tank ammunition, as well as artillery shells. There's never been a bill like this introduced in Congress that would tie the hands of a president and forbid them, prevent them legally from delivering weapons to Israel. This bill now has the support of more than 1/4 of all Democrats in Congress. And let's be very clear. As our public opinion polling research found after the 2024 elections, the number one reason why voters who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024, the number one reason was not the economy. It was not healthcare. It was not women's reproductive rights. It was Gaza. That's not an opinion. That we have the receipts from public opinion polls showing that this was the top reason why people did not vote for Harris in 2024. Nearly 30% of all voters who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Harris in 2024 cited Gaza as the reason. So let's be very clear. The base of the Democratic Party is solidly behind Palestinian rights. Public opinion poll after public opinion poll shows that 3/4 of all Democrats believe Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, and 3/4 of all Democrats want to end weapons to Israel. This is virtual consensus amongst the Democratic base. And when we see leaders of the Democratic Party, like Hakeem Jeffries, still today defending taking AIPAC money,
Yeah.
after AIPAC not only lobbied for this $30 billion in weapons that have gone to Israel to facilitate this genocide, but also backed more than 100 insurrectionists who tried to overthrow our democracy in 2020. How can any Democratic leader be so out of step and so out of tune with where their party is and expect to represent it in Congress? So we're seeing dramatic changes take place in the electoral arena. There are now more than 200 Democratic congressional candidates who have said, if I get to Congress, I am voting to block the bombs to Israel. This is a major historic transformation in the electoral landscape. Let me be very clear. Democratic members of Congress are following the lead of where public opinion is. And I think in the very near future, we are going to get to a point where Democrats in Congress truly represent and reflect that majority Democratic opinion. Now, I don't want to be too partisan because we also need to talk about dramatic changes that are taking place on the Republican side of the aisle. There are splits and fissures within Republican opinion as well. We polled public opinion as well, Republican public opinion as well. And we found that a majority of GOP voters under age 45 also want to end weapons to Israel and are also horrified by the ways in which we have supported this genocide. So this is also, in a sense, a generational shift that's underway in US politics, that's simply shedding the old platitudes of lockstep support for Israel that's been horrified by this live stream genocide that we've watched over the past 2 years and is fundamentally rejecting the politics of the past. So I believe that US politics are going to be dramatically transformed. I don't believe that US support for Israel is a long-term proposition. I think it's coming to an end, and I think it's going to come to an end very quickly and very decisively.
Well, you anticipated my next question, so maybe you can make this brief because I do have a longer question to wrap things up because I know your time is short. But I was going to follow up with, I attended the People's Conference on Palestine in Detroit last year, and thousands of mostly young people were there supporting Palestine of all stripes. I know that Jewish Voice for Peace, there's a youth movement that's driving. I mean, there's the old timers, right, who are coming out of Vietnam and civil rights protests and all the rest. But Jewish Voice for Peace now, the youth movement there is strong in support of Palestinian rights. You deal with students all the time, Josh. There's a really growing resistance movement. It's not going to be long-term U.S. support for Israel.
No, I agree. And, what student leaders did in putting together these really powerful encampments across the country was to dramatize how mobilized the youth were in support of Palestinian rights and opposed to Israel's genocide. In what other example do we have in the history of the United States of the political establishment coming down in such a systematically harsh way against student protesters? And I don't want to skim over the fact that, of course, you had the National Guard gunning down and executing student protesters during Vietnam at Kent State, at Jackson State in Mississippi, a massacre of Black students that's often forgotten from the
Yeah.
protest movement against America's war in Vietnam, by the way. So, thankfully, we did not see the Army or the National Guard execute students for protesting for Palestinian rights. But the crackdown against those students was in many ways much more systematized than crackdowns against protests for divestment against apartheid in South Africa and against the US war in Vietnam. And by that, I mean, we have the Trump administration forcing these humiliating capitulations against universities around the country for allowing students to engage in their First Amendment protected rights to protest and to speak. These are multi-billion-dollar lawsuits where the Trump administration has not only extorted money from universities as quote unquote punishment for allowing these pro-Palestinian protests to take place, but also their consent to fundamental changes in their university policies that restrict the abilities of faculty and staff and students to speak out and organize for Palestinian rights. You never had that kind of systematized governmental crackdown against protests for freedom in South Africa and against the Vietnam War and for civil rights on university campuses. So let's be very clear. The amount of repression that the student movement has seen in speaking up for Palestinian rights has truly been unprecedented in the history of student protest in this country. And the fact that you have ICE agents abducting students off of the street and placing them in detention is unconscionable. And you still have protesters who have been locked in ICE detention for now coming up on almost a year. Lekakordia is a Palestinian student and activist who was snatched by ICE. Not only has she been jailed for a year, but the neglect, the bad quality of food has led to a significant physical deterioration of this young woman. And so bad that she fell over and she had a seizure while she was in prison. Do you know what ICE did? They took her to a hospital and they handcuffed her to a bed, and they refused to tell her parents or her lawyers where she was while she was having a medical emergency. Does this sound familiar, Michael? Because this is what Israel does when it shoots and wounds Palestinian protesters. It arrests them and shackles them in bed when they're in the hospital. So this is another way that the foreign policy and the domestic policy are intertwining. So it's extremely dangerous. We have to continue speaking up. We have to continue defending these students who are bravely like facing literal abduction by ICE for speaking out in support of Palestinian rights.
I want to get this question in. It comes from our mutual friend, Mark Braverman. Um, I'll just read it. He sent it to me before. I think he's on the call, but let me read it to you. We see the connection between U.S. actions abroad, Palestine and the entire region, now Cuba and Venezuela, the list goes on. Perhaps the key question for us in the movement in this moment. With the U.S. settler colonial DNA now in full display, it brings the fight home as never before. How might this guide our own organizing strategy? And now here's the key. If we were to shift our focus from stop Israeli genocide to stop U.S. human rights crimes at home and abroad, might that inject energy and help focus our work? And might it be the key to addressing the silence of churches and bring the church movement into alliance with the broader movement for Palestine? So thanks, Mark, for that question. Josh, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of wisdom in Mark's question and his suggestions there. I do think it speaks to the need to have an intersectional politics to understand the connections between all of these issues and to, struggle in support of communities that are facing the brunt of these policies and to join hands together. Absolutely.
I want to give Josh the last word, but before I do, just a reminder, if you're interested in either one of our upcoming tours, June's Solidarity Tour to Palestine, or especially in late September, early October, in the footsteps of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, with an emphasis on South Africa's solidarity with Palestine. And you've seen some of the speakers that we'll be meeting with. Please email me. Josh, thanks for joining us today. Your closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for having me on as a guest. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all this afternoon and to talk through all of these very difficult challenges that we're facing. You know, people say that we're such a polarized society and polarized country right now. And of course, the occupant of the White House is actively driving that polarization. But I think what unites Americans, so many Americans right now, is just disgust with our political system, just disgust with the fact that our country, which seems to have endless amounts of money to engage in warfare, to topple leaders of other countries, to threaten the invasion of foreign countries, and to arm another country to commit genocide. How is it that we have these hundreds of billions of dollars for war, and now Trump wants to increase the Department of War? And I'm actually very glad that he renamed it the Department of War, because I think it's much more apt and much more correct than the Department of Defense. So kudos to him for being honest about the purpose of the Department of War. He wants to increase the Department of War's budget by 50% to $1.5 trillion a year. How is it possible that we have this money, but we cannot house our own people? We cannot provide health care to our own people. We cannot provide a decent living wage to help lift millions and millions of Americans out of a cycle of poverty where they're living paycheck to paycheck. It's not that we don't have the resources to do all of these things. As we make very clear in our social media, we could have solved the problem of unhoused individuals in this country, or providing nutritional assistance to Americans who are going hungry at night. 20% of American children go hungry every night, Michael, because their families can't afford food. We could solve all of these problems very easily through just not sending weapons to Israel. That's it. So we have the resources. So while we are very, very divided as a country right now, I think there's bipartisan understanding that this system simply does not work, that this system needs to be retooled and reconceptualized to address the human needs of people, both here and abroad, instead of investing in death and destruction and constant warfare. The American people are ready for a fundamental change. We are doing our part to elect an entirely new generation of leaders to Congress to get us to that point. That is our mission. We need an entire new philosophy of governance and leadership in this country to ensure that we're taking care of people's needs at home and abroad, and not investing in militarism and warfare and genocide abroad.
Josh, as always, you've been incisive and insightful, and we appreciate your bold stance and your insights. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Michael.